Since the dawn of mankind, religion and religious movements have played a pivotal role in the development of humankind. They have shaped political and cultural movements and, in fact, altered in many ways the trajectory of the world itself. However, with every established religion, there are going to be groups and offshoots that break away from culturally established norms and create their own religious practices that to some might seem secretive and odd, and to others might seem dangerous. Today on Desks and Dorks, we're going to be talking about cults, secret religious groups, and heretical religious beliefs. Hello everybody, my name is Kyle Ott. I am the Dork. A couple things. If you want to help us, the single best way to do so right now is to back our Kickstarter. This is for A Fear Within. It is Pokemon by way of Stephen King. It is a RPG where you are going to play as kids and the monsters that live inside them, fighting against an eldritch abomination. Again, it's the single best way to help us out, and all of our stretch goals, because guess what, we're fully funded, go to making every copy of the book better for every single backer, not just the ones who backed at the highest levels. So if you do want to help us make the best available game that we can, this is the best way to do so. Link to that's in the description below, or you can click the QR code on your screen, or take a picture of it, I should say. It's not clickable, sorry. A couple things before we get officially started. I want to talk about what we're going to discuss, but obviously we are talking about cults, which are groups that usually pride themselves on being very secretive, which means my information is a little bit harder to find and a little bit more limited than it usually might be, but I did manage to find a couple great examples of cults and cult-like behavior that we're going to discuss. And again, this is designed to be a general primer. Remember, I was trained as a medievalist. It was not something that I made into a career, but I was trained at it at university. So this is a general primer, a medieval buffet. I'm not going to be going super deep into a lot of topics. I've had a couple people complain in some less than polite terms in the comments that I'm clearly not a historian because I'm not using the terms that are perfect in the nomenclature. For example, calling chainmail, or what is actually ringmail, chainmail. Look, I'm doing this to sort of reach the widest possible audience, and as such, I'm going to be taking some liberties with nomenclature and with some of the stuff that I present so that it is more easily digestible to that core audience. It's not something that I hide, it's something that I make clear at the beginning of every one of these intros. This is not designed to go super deep. If you are looking for doctoral level dissertations on history, I would suggest you go elsewhere. There are some really great ones. In fact, actually, I think Harvard just posted a bunch of ones that I have yet to go through in their backlog. So again, just wanted to make that very clear. One last thing, I'm going to be leaving out vast swaths of the medieval world for this research because my training was as a Western medievalist. That means that I focused very much so on Western medieval Europe at large, the Renaissance, especially in Italy, and in ancient Rome, which means I do not have the level of understanding or nuance to treat some of those non-Western cultures and their religious beliefs with the respect and reverence that they deserve. Those time periods, those people, they are worth engaging with. However, again, I'm going to bring this up right now because I think it's important in good faith to let you know why I am leaving those swaths of the world out. With that out of the way, let's talk about safety tools. That's right. If we're going to be delving into some of the darker and more odious stuff that cults have done in the past, and that a lot of times clandestine religious groups in fantasy usually play around with, I do think it's an important thing to maybe check in on your players. It's probably something that you should do. And I actually think there's one tool that I think is particularly helpful for this, which is, of course, a tone conversation. Now, if you're like me, my session zeros are usually pretty quick and snappy and to the point, and one of the things that I know I like doing is talking about the type of tone and atmosphere that I want for my particular game. This is really interesting because I have run cult games that sometimes play very fast and loose with the idea of cults. Yes, you can have a totally zany religious group that, I don't know, worships the little things that you screw onto tires so that the air doesn't go out of the air valve. That was a thing that we had in a particular game. You can also have ones that are reminiscent of established Western religious groups like the Cathars in, of course, Innistrad. You could also have ones that dabble in human sacrifice and other more odious practices that might be objectionable to some players. I think having a tone conversation at the beginning allows you to establish what kind of game everybody is looking for, and I think that's a pretty good idea to maybe get players who don't want to take part in your type of game not playing in it, and to give your players a little bit of background in what you're about to delve into. Again, this just helps to establish everybody's expectations about sensitive content matter, which I do think is an important part about being a GM. It also helps to ensure that everybody is getting the kind of cult they want. As much as I love my big, devious, and dark cults, I kind of also enjoy the Perry the Platypus cult just a little bit. Something that came up in the Desks and Dorks Discord, actually at the time of me editing this, was that people brought up that modern HOAs can kind of be cult-like, and the idea of the cult of Karen is one of the greatest things that I've ever heard. Sometimes I want a game like like that. But with that out of the way, let's talk about one of the most important things imaginable, because for us in the modern era, it might seem a little bit interesting to why you would join a cult in the first place. And there were a lot of reasons, but usually, and the most important concept and aspect to consider, is that people joined cults because they offered something that an established religion didn't. What you're looking at right now is a bas relief for the cult of Mithras. This was a cult that managed to creep its way into the Roman Empire and gained a ton of popularity among Roman soldiers. Now, there were a couple reasons for this. Part of it was that the Romans loved the focus on discipline or the militant disposition of some of Mithras's beliefs, but part of it was that Mithras offered Roman soldiers something that they didn't get from their own established pantheon, which was the idea of eternal life after death. And for somebody who risked their lives on the borders of the empire battling against their foes, this was a very attractive belief. It's part of the reason that Mithras's cult gained so much influence very early on in its inception, particularly among Rome's military. Another thing that you could get are social benefits. In the medieval Europe, for example, the clergy and the work of the Catholic Church may or may not have started for the poor and for the people, but it grew to be something that was actually sort of, run by the privileged and the elite, and it was very difficult for some folks, particularly peasants or the uneducated, to get part of those social benefits of being a part of that church, and cults, in many cases, could appeal to lower classes who had no aspect or no way of getting into those established channels. There is something to be said about giving somebody a chance at a better life and social mobility, and for some, cults offered that. Another one is, of course, political benefits. This happens very often in literature and in speculative fiction. We talk about the Freemasons being an organization that controls the world from behind the scenes of their shadow government. But realistically, that probably isn't the case. But some cults did have politically influential members, and it's entirely possible that you could, by becoming a part of that cult, curry favor with those individuals who had the sort of political power and sway that might be able to benefit you. And as an added bonus, in some areas and in some regions of the world where cults gained a great deal of prominence, you could find yourself from going on the political out group into the political in group and gaining a great deal of power, authority, and ability from there. But let's also not forget that there were a great deal of monetary benefits to joining a cult as well. Let's not forget at the time that cults would have been springing up in prominence and in danger, one of the things that was happening was that the tithe for the Catholic Church was, at the time and still is, a major source of the organization's income. It takes a percentage of its worshippers' income as tithe, and that goes to ostensibly helping to maintain some of the social services and social buildings used by the Catholic Church to carry on its outreach. However, in practice, particularly in the Middle Ages, this would have gone on to sort of enrich the pockets of members of the ecclesiarchy and as Catholic officials in general. This means that if you were a cult leader, you could expect, potentially, to tithe your own members and as a result, gain a little bit of monetary benefit too. And remember, if you do manage to get in on the political inroads and get into the political in-group, a lot of times that does come with power and wealth as well. But now that we've discussed the reasons why someone would join a cult, let's talk about how would cults operate, because this actually is an interesting concept to think about, particularly if we're going to interject them into our own tabletop role-playing games. Now, the first one I want you to think about, and the first concept I'd like us to consider, is that for most religions and religious movements, location is directly related to power. I'm going to draw your attention to this Gothic cathedral right here, and I want you to take note of a couple features. You see, it's easy for us in the modern era to look at a cathedral like this and just assume that it is a building for worship, but this is actually something that isn't true. In the Middle Ages, a cathedral was more than just a place to congregate for mass. It was more than a place to hold community events and political events of great importance. No, in many cases and in most ways, the medieval cathedral was synonymous with the power and the ability of the Catholic Church. You see, these structures would have taken a great deal of time, expertise, and money, and you can understand the level of which just by looking at it. Look at the details on the stonework right above the door. Look at the different panels of the stained glass windows. Those would have been actually woven essentially with steel in the glass, or at least iron in the glass, to try to help those colored panes maintain its shape. The pews would have been carved. The arches above the actual place that everyone congregates are made with vast hard wood that has been carved into those intricate shapes. Even the pulpit, which is right there in the center, that little ramp essentially that leads up to a small balcony looking area, would have been carved out of solid solid stone. Every inch of this place is designed to ooze opulence and to ooze power, and there's a reason for that. Partially, this is a cynical thing, right? The Catholic Church wanted to be able to flex its opulence and its power. Part of it, however, was that this space was designed to get you to think about God. Obviously, imagine being a peasant in a one-room cottage or in a one-room hut, and then deciding that you were going to come into this space, this area, which would have been like nothing you had ever seen. These works of art were more than just community spaces. They were designed to get you to think about God, about heaven, and about your place in the celestial order of things. Now, let's contrast that with the idea of the cult base in most classic fantasy games. Now, here's the thing. This illustration, this art is evocative, it's interesting, it is compelling, and it's just kind of badass. But the truth of the matter is that the Catholic Church, at the time of the Middle Ages, had the luxury of being the most important religion in the world, something that would have dominated the lives of both monarch and peasant, and because of that, they were able to take the resources and time to build those structures because they lived without fear of being destroyed. This is not the case with most cults. Because of their outside status, cults would have met in secret, and because they met in secret, they kind of just made do with whatever they could. A lot of cults would have met in forests and or caves, areas that were out of the way, or areas that were remote in order to avoid access by interlopers or individuals who were not a part of the cult. One of the best examples of this are the caves in which we found the Gnostic Gospels in the modern-day Middle East. The Gnostic Gospels, for those not in the know, are an apocryphal set of Gospels, which means they were written outside of the control of the Catholic Church, or those that were approved by the Catholic Church over a very long period of time. That's a video that is entirely its own thing, but if you're interested, please let me know in the comments below. I might actually do it. But the important thing for us to remember is that this cliffside cave that is far out of the way and off the beaten path is where these individuals would have stashed these holy texts that would have, again, existed outside of the control of the early church. Now, this is by no means the only or the perfect example of a cave hideout, but again, something like this where they hid the Gnostic Gospels goes a long way in illustrating the kind of out-of-the-way places that a cult would use in order to actually meet. Now, however, as cool as those things are, they're not the only ones. A regular house housed by a peasant would also be a place for cults to worship or cults to meet. Taverns or custom houses, ale houses, whatever, or common houses, inns, would have also been a place for cults to gather and for cults to recruit new members and even worship. It's important for us to consider that although cults are often draped in mystique and secrecy and all of those amazing little narrative twists and turns that we like, these are, for the most part, regular folk. And so, if they don't have the ability to build a giant, ominous-looking temple with great spiky spires and, red-robed assistants, they're probably just going to take the time to meet wherever they could. And in some cases, that's just kind of your house, or like the basement, or the attic, or if you have none of those things, the woods. But again, these cultists would have been able to make do and would have used pretty much anything that they had available to them because in a lot of cases, cultists were the common man. Again, another thing though is that sometimes cultists were wealthy individuals, people with privilege, people with status, power, wealth, and political clout. And in those instances, you could have an entire cult-based manor. Perhaps one of the most interesting examples of this is the Earl of Sandwich, which, yes, the Earl of Sandwich, the creator of the wonderful little bread and cheese combination that we all have come to know and enjoy, was in fact a member of a satanic cult and would commonly use his manor to conduct cult business and use it as a place for cult meetings, which I think is just a neat little bit of trivia. Shout out to the guy that made sandwiches. Isn't that kind of cool? But yeah, it's always going to depend on the cultist, on the individual themselves, and on the spaces that are available to them. So you, as a game master, basically have historical carte blanche to put your cult anywhere that it would be thematically appropriate and consistent with the story and the world that you have constructed. But now that we've talked about these types of cults and cult bases, let's talk about cult symbols and organization. You see, cults, again, are concerned with three things. In many cases, it's survival. Can the cult continue to recruit members without being either wiped out or assimilated, which is a thing? Can the cult maintain its level of secrecy? And lastly, can it do so long enough that it will ensure that it is allowed a degree of power, either the power to continue to advance or the power to ensure their survival no matter what when they are faced against whatever kind of rivals? And again, we have to talk about this because cult symbols were oftentimes used as a way to identify other cult members, which means they had to be very easy to make. They had to be clandestine enough that they could be either done quickly so that you could ascertain someone's identity and then immediately be done without being caught. And they had to be something that was relatively simple and innocuous, but also something that could be so distinct that you wouldn't confuse regular individuals with cult members. And in fact, let's talk about one of the symbols that one of the biggest cults in the entire world used. The fish symbol. Yes, this is usually found on the bumpers of youth pastors and tattooed to like 40-year-old Christian wine moms. But in fact, this fish symbol was the early symbol of the Catholic Church, or of the Christian faith, however you want to do it, when it was still considered a cult in the eyes of the Roman Empire. Now, this is something I learned in Catholic school as a kid, so I'm not entirely sure how accurate this is historically, but the apocryphal story goes that if somebody suspected that there was another Christian in their midst, what they would do is they would draw one half of the fish in the sand, and then the other person would draw the other half of the fish. They would then wipe the sand away, and it would confirm that the identity of the other person. Now, again, obviously the fact that we know so much about this symbol and that it has become so widespread means that this is perhaps dubious in historical quality, but it does make for an interesting example of how a simple cult symbol like this one could have been used. If you go to draw the first half of the fish and you think somebody isn't actually Christian, you could have easily been like, just doodle some more stuff in the sand and passed it off as something that you did in those few idle moments that you had. But again, you could have done it very quickly, and if the other person was a Christian, then you could have been able to identify them at little risk to yourself without having to say anything and catch the attention of somebody onlooking. Again, how many of you have ever scribbled in the dirt when you were a kid? My guess is probably quite a few. This would have been a really easy way to sort of pass things off without actually getting caught. And I chose this as an example because if you are creating your own cults, having identifying symbols or images might be a really helpful thing. I have talked about the cult of Mithras quite a bit here, but again, a cult like Mithras could have identifying symbols. In Mithras's case, the symbol is always somebody, essentially Mithras themselves, slaying a bull. Now, what would have been potentially interesting is imagine putting a bull above a butcher shop, for example, or a slaughterhouse. You, as the owner of said slaughterhouse, could easily pass this off as something that you need or as a symbol of your trade. However, if you were a member of the cult of Mithras, you could look at the bull above the shop and realize, maybe this is somebody that I could look on as a potential friend. But in addition to the symbols that you would need to identify fellow members, let's talk about how cults would occasionally organize themselves. Temples wouldn't have been totally uncommon, particularly in Rome, where it was very common for the empire to assimilate cults that they believe would be useful to the state in some way, shape, or form. So some cults might have actually gotten some pretty opulent temples. Obviously, I did not choose these as cult temples, but they're pretty opulent in general and cool to look at. But having an established temple does offer a lot to a cult. On the first thing, it offers legitimacy. If you are able to build a structure that opulent, that large, it means that you have legitimacy in the eyes of the state, and that comes with a whole bunch of perks, like not having to meet in caves and forests, and also being a part of power and the systems of governance in an area. It also gives you recognition, and I do think recognition is different than legitimacy. It is one thing to be recognized by the state. It is another thing to have a temple dedicated to your god with all of the trappings of your worship being available to the common populace. It makes recruitment a lot more easier, and it allows, again, for you to be a part of that community. If my temple looks unique and has unique features, a peasant or an individual might be like, hey, oh yeah, the temple to such and such god is right over there. And lastly, it offers you a place in the community. You can hold events in this temple. You can recruit in this temple. You can house individuals in this temple. You could, accrue wealth or resources and store them in the temple. Having an access to a place like this in the community cannot be understated, but that red X in the middle is what you should look at, because we're going right to the things that make it not a great thing. It is easy to find, so if the state or the people in that region decide that they don't want you there as a known quantity, it is really easy to sort of take you out. Important documents or people, putting all of them in one place, provides for a great amount of danger to the cult, and it's expensive both in terms of time, how much time it takes to make the temple, material, quarrying the stone, logging the wood, and so on, and the labor that is needed to do there. So a lot of cults did not have temples, or if they did have temples, they would have been smaller and far less opulent than the ones that I showed. Smaller cult temples are actually fairly common, as we talked about, in ancient Rome. However, in my reading and research, the one thing that came up the most is cells. No, I don't mean like a cell phone. No, I'm actually talking about smaller groups of secretive individuals meeting in private and conducting cult worship on those bases. Some cells might be as small as 4 to 6 people. A family of Christian worshippers during the early age of Rome and the early formation of the Christian church and the Christian faith, that would have technically been considered a cult cell. Some cells could have been several hundred people in length, and in some cases, several thousand. I'm thinking, of course, of the Bar Kokhba revolts in Rome, but again, or in Galilee, I should say, but those revolts had massive cells of Jewish rebels and zealots who were trying to overthrow the yoke of Roman rule. These cells, of course, carried a couple different things, safety and secrecy being chief among them. It is far easier to hide your religious gatherings if you have 4 to 10 people than it is if you have, 2,000 meeting in a large opulent temple, and it's very easy for you to move your meetings if it's just a single table and the rudimentary artifacts for worship in a forest, as opposed to even a small, humble temple that is, built next to the wall of a larger structure in a city. It also lends focus. Having a small amount of people means it is easier for you to focus your efforts and your goals and align them with one another in order to get stuff done. Anybody who's worked at a long-term group project knows that the less people in the group project, usually the better it goes. However, with this comes some other difficulties. It's hard to spread the message when you must maintain your secrecy for your own safety. Coordination can be difficult, particularly when communication and infrastructure are an issue like they were in the Middle Ages and during the fall of the Roman Empire. It can be hard to coordinate with other cells in other places. And lastly, this is the most important one because it's something that came up a bunch in the research that I did. Cells could develop priorities over time that came into conflict with other cells. Remember, these are people who are passionate about their religion, their faith, and their beliefs, and as such, it means that they might indeed come into conflict with one another, and you could essentially be duking it out with somebody that you once considered your brother in faith because they have a different idea of what they want and a different interpretation of how your faith should grow and develop. But now that we've discussed the ways that a cult might develop, grow, and change, let's talk about the response to cults in the ancient world and in the medieval world. And one of the things to take into account is that this is going to vary wildly based on culture, based on time, and based on the values of the populace. You will find in the ancient world, for example, where polytheism is far more common, that cults generally tend to be a little bit more tolerated and assimilated into the empire or into whatever country is present. But as we go and drift into monotheistic religions, cults become an active threat to that power system. The cult of Mithras, which we have mentioned many times, was actually widely tolerated by the Roman state, and in fact did have several different locations where it could be worshipped, and especially among those military members, it was kind of just expected that some of them would be followers of Mithras. It seems like there was a little bit of pushback at different points during the empire's history, but for the most part, the cult was sort of left to grow and develop all on its own. Assimilation is a really useful thing when a cult or a religious group provides some sort of value to the state, and again, Rome's greatest strength is its logistics, but if one could make an argument that Rome had a different strength, I would argue that it's its ability to take anything that isn't Roman, consume it, spit out the parts that it can't use, and then continue on with whatever traits it had that benefited the empire. Actually, I might argue that is the greatest strength of Rome, and it's exactly what Rome did with many different cults, including the cult of Mithras, but again, it also worked for certain other cults. The cult of Isis, for example, the religious deity of the Egyptian pantheon, is another one that seemed to gain a great deal of popularity among the Roman citizenry, and it was one that the Romans sort of treated with a hearty little shrug, a head nod, and they just kind of kept it pushing. But there was another thing that could potentially happen, and that is a takeover. You see, in some instances, a cult could ingrain itself into the political systems of an area, and in other influences, could in fact gain popular support enough to overthrow a political system and become the new power in the region. This was certainly true of the Cathars in southern France, who actually were able to establish themselves in the county of Toulouse. The Cathars are a sect or a splinter group of the Catholic faith, and we're going to be talking about them a little bit later, but they believed in a lot of the rejection of the worldly themes of the Catholic Church, and in many ways they're a response to the corruption that they saw around them, and they were sort of able to carve out not an empire, but carve out essentially a sphere of influence for themselves that was almost unheard of in the medieval world. This is something that could potentially happen if a cult gained enough power. And of course we have to talk about extermination. You see, in some instances, cults were deemed to be such a threat to the established order or to the powers that be that there was really nothing else to do but attempt to root them out and destroy them. This, of course, did happen to our friends the Cathars, the Albigensian Crusades, which essentially take place smack dab in the middle of the crusading era, were done entirely to get rid of them, although not entirely out of religious desires. If we're being completely honest, there's some secular desires there that I think are the primary reasons for that crusade. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But of course, this is true in many cases for the early Christians, who did find themselves to be the subject of exterminations in ancient Rome. I think this is largely due to the fact that many of the cults that Rome treated with a degree of respect and a modicum of power were willing to assimilate so long as they accepted certain tenets of religious truth, like, for example, accepting the cult of the emperor, or in other cases, just for sort of paying certain amounts of taxes and agreeing to assimilate to Rome culturally, which the early Christians were in fact not willing to do, which is, of course, part of the reason for their extermination. There's a very real case to be made that if the ancient Roman Christians had decided to play ball, they probably wouldn't have been exterminated. But again, this is something that happened, and it's in fact something the Roman Christians did to the cult of Mithras in the 4th century. So, despite the fact that the Roman Christians were themselves the target of persecution and extermination, later on they actually took steps to stamp out the cult of Mithras, both in the military and in most political institutions as well. So again, if a cult or if a state decides that it is going to be, or religious movement, whatever you want to call it, decides that a cult is too much of a threat, they will take great pains and great steps to make sure that such an organization is completely eliminated, either through political persecution, imprisonments, or good old-fashioned violence. But now that we've discussed how cults would grow, change, develop, and be treated by the ancient and medieval world, let's talk about the types of cults. I have divided these into 3 different sections. One of the ones, especially this is true if you are running a Bronze Age campaign or a campaign set in some allegory of the Roman Empire, is the idea that there were existing gods entering and then being assimilated within an imperial or empire-like or kingdom-based structure. These included, of course, Isis. I mentioned Isis, the Egyptian deity, right there, which of course did have a spot in Rome, especially in Roman households, especially had a great influx of Roman women that were sort of growing in that worship. But of course it includes our good pal Mithras as well, who had their origins as a Persian deity. This is particularly common in polytheistic worlds and in polytheistic game settings, where you can expect a cross-cultural blend of ideas, and through that blend of ideas comes the assimilation of new gods and new deities. I think this is a really interesting way to do it. And again, it is very true to life both in Rome and in ancient Greece and in a lot of places within the Mesopotamian world, that new cultures would introduce new deities. Those deities would then be taken and then stuff would be added to them based on the values of the culture that they came to. This is how we get quite a lot of the ancient and Bronze Age cults, and I think it's something that you should use in your particular games. One of the other ones that I found really interesting while reading this, because again, as I had mentioned a couple videos, I grew up Catholic, I'm still Catholic. At one point I was discerning a role as a Catholic priest, were the saint cults, which is really interesting because in many cases, small pockets of medieval society would actually take and venerate the saints and elevate them to the level of local gods or local deities. I found this particular article to be of great interest, which is How Did Cults and Saints Spread Across the Medieval Christian World. I would highly encourage you to give it a try. It is absolutely free and it's available online. I will hopefully put a hyperlink in the description below, but this is the title, that is the author below. I thought this was particularly interesting, but it's entirely common for some secular figures. This is from that article that I mentioned. This is a manuscript about King Oswald, who was a local lord and then later was elevated to a sort of folk hero, a fantasy character, and later to a minor deity level, which I thought was really interesting and intriguing. But this was also very true for Catholic saints. Now, in the actual Catholic teaching, saints are not supposed to be venerated above God or above any other individual of importance, like Jesus or the Holy Spirit, for example. However, in pockets of the Middle Ages and in small towns, villages, or the hinterlands, it would be entirely possible for saint worship to become a real thing, and a saint could be seen as a protector, local deity, or local god to those people. This is in fact such a common occurrence that we actually had saintly reliquary theft as a huge issue, as peasants would flock to the burial sites of their saints in an attempt to grab bones, artifacts, scraps of clothing, or any number of different things in a way to sort of gain and power and curry favor with their saint turned local deity, which I think is really interesting and particularly intriguing. And last but certainly not least, offshoots of major religious movements can also be considered cults. We turn our attention to the Cathars again, who took the work of the Catholic Church and in many ways reinterpreted it. I want to give special attention to the Cathars, however, because in many ways, religious movements like the Cathars are responses to real-world issues with major faiths, right? The Cathars rejected the priesthood in its entirety and the Pope as well, seeing the institution of Catholicism as inherently corrupt. Now, this might seem extreme to the outside eye, but you have to take into account what was going on at this time. The Albigensian Crusade takes place smack dab in the middle of the Crusades, and I'm going to take a moment to address a comment that I've been getting quite a few times in the comment section, where a lot of folks are saying, hey, the main goal of the Crusades was religious, and I don't think that's entirely true. It's impossible for us to discount religion from the Crusades. Right, on an individual level, a singular crusader, whether they are a nobleman or a knight, might potentially have religious views in mind, but it's really important for us to consider what kind of forces would have been mobilizing this vast amount of troops. A individual person might want to go to the crusade because they genuinely believe they are called to do so for religious reasons, but a king, a state, a banking institution, a secular institution that has a vested interest in real estate and the free flow of trade is probably not going to bankroll your expedition to the Holy Land unless they think there's some monetary gain to get from it. And I think the Cathars are a perfect example of this because they came at a time where a lot of folks, even in the Middle Ages where Catholicism was so important, were grappling with the idea that maybe, just maybe, this institution was far more corrupt than they had been willing to believe or willing to accept. And in many ways, cults like the Cathars are a response to religious institutions of the day or the issues that plague religious members and lay people. And I think that's a really important thing to think about and consider. But now that we've covered the different types of cults, it's finally time for us to talk about how to use our cults in TTRPGs. I've decided to make 3 different cults for you that I thought were particularly interesting, or that I highlighted some of the abilities and some of the research that I did. I think if you're going to use a cult, you really need to tie it into the cult's identity and make that a core component of their abilities and what they bring to the table, both literally and figuratively. And so our first one is one that I really love, and as somebody who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, I love Quest for Camelot and Mordred and his take of being so obsessed with swords and weapons and power that he decides to sacrifice a part of his humanity and the humanity of his fellows in order to gain access to those abilities. And so I have dubbed this cult the chorus of living metal. I love this particular bandit design. They have been fused to armor and weapons, but in doing so have lost a great deal of what made them who they were. These cultists cannot be disarmed, and they can actually absorb metal that touches them, including weapons, which makes them a very big terror on the battlefield against melee combatants. However, as those of you who have been following the channel know for any length of time, I believe that combat should feel like a puzzle, and although these guys are absolute brick houses, or metal houses in this case, in melee combat, they carry with them a few unique flaws. Rust can in fact destroy them and is so debilitating they actually recoil from rust or water in general with a great deal of fear. The other thing though is that heat metal or similar fire spells in other games actually roasts them from the inside out. You see, it's only the exterior shell of the chorus of living metal that has taken on the properties of iron and steel, but the inside is still full of lovely little fleshy bits, and your players can most likely find some exciting ways to deal with that. Now, I love this particular one. This is Isaac Zurin's Brutal Flesh, and it got me thinking, what if the temple itself was the thing that they worshipped? I just called this The Temple is Alive, but you can of course adapt this to any number of systems or concepts. But the thing is very simple. The players have to destroy the temple itself, but in doing so, they begin to gestate as the temple fills with noxious gas and acid, which are essentially its way of digesting its food. Cultists who live within the temple also begin to become digested, which would be a problem, except that every time one of the cultists falls in battle, the temple itself gets the ability to either refresh one of its own abilities or restore part of its lost health. This means that the players are going to constantly be bouncing between dealing with the mobs, again those cultists that come and fight them, and are going to be trying to dedicate some amount of their time and expertise to destroying the temple itself. And finally, I absolutely love this art by Clint Kearley. This is the cult of shared experience, because not all cults are evil. This is something that we actually talked about, or I've at least hinted and insinuated at in this video, but in many cases, cultists are just trying to live their lives. Some cults are evil, are terrifying, are there to interject horrific things, but a lot of them are just people who have a difference in religious opinion and are just trying to exist. And the cult of shared experience is one of those potential cults. They believe that, of course, the burden of human suffering could be lighter if it is split among all folks. And so by joining the cult, you take part in its bond. This means that damage, exhaustion, and the effects of disease and poison are spread among all members in a given area. So a fatal blow that would be, detrimental to a single person is then actually spread across multiple different cultists, and as a result, the cultists are able to live through it. However, because I love combat as a puzzle, this is very detrimental in the effect of group or area of effect spells, because what happens when it hits every single member the same amount, but is then multiplied and increased because it hits every single member all at the same time? Or what happens when faced with an instant death effect or a really debilitating poison, toxin, or magical ability when that gets spread to the cult entirely? And I think that is a fantastic angle to take on a cult like this one. And that, my dear friends, brings us to the end of our video today. If you have liked this video, please, all of the YouTube pleasantries help us out a great deal, especially sharing, but the most important and the best way to help is to go and back us on Kickstarter, or to share the Kickstarter link with anyone that you feel would be inclined to back us on Kickstarter. This is the single best way to help us. We are already fully funded, and we would love to have you along for the ride. Again, the link to that is in the description below, or you can take a picture of the QR code at your earliest convenience. Now, before I end off, a reminder, we are going to be doing the Q&A section here, but if you are parting ways with me right now, that's totally okay. But if you have questions about cults, they might have been answered in our Q&A section, which is coming up right now. But until next time, Kyle for Desks and Dorks, you all have been amazing. Peace. Hello, Dadbod. We did it. We've officially made it to the end of the video. It's time for Q&A. I am so tired. This has been... Oh man, I hope that I didn't sound too sick for this, because I gotta be honest with y'all, I feel like death warmed over. But you know what? We got through it. We did it. We did it for you, for the cults. That's a weird sentence to say as an adult. It's Q&A time. If those of you who are joining us for the first time, the way that Q&As work, if you're a member of the Discord, or if you are a person who comments on our community tabs on YouTube, this is where you ask some particular questions. I'm going to go over the YouTube ones first, then I'm going to go over ones that I liked in the Discord. I'm going to continue to go through this presentation as much as I remember. This is unedited. It's not unscripted, because none of the videos are actually scripted, but it's unedited, which is probably the most important part. So, okay, Maloon Tarka asked, what is the difference between a cult and a high control group? He said that cults use similar techniques to control members, but do these grow organically? Do the leaders learn, innovate, and implement? And the answer to that question is, I think most of it is the same, to be quite honest. Like, a high control group is like, not all high control groups are cults, but most cults are high control groups, I think, is probably the best way of doing that. When does a cult stop being a cult and become an average religion? I would say when it gains widespread acceptance, either culturally or politically, probably both, if I'm being completely honest. Do cults always have... Wow, this is a lot of questions. You're getting a ton from me here, Maloon. Do cults always have charismatic leaders and hierarchies? The answer to that question is usually yes. Although in the instance of, like, particularly of Catharism, it doesn't seem like there was, like, one charismatic leader, but like a series of relatively okay leaders, and just a lot of political and cultural dissent about what was going on, and that sort of fomented to create the Cathars. I don't want to speak too highly on that, but can they be more egalitarian? Yeah, I think a lot of cults are egalitarian, to be honest, because they kind of have to be just off rip. Like, you can't really get away with running a cult as a super corrupt thing, or at least overtly corrupt, because you might run risk of losing some members. Although, again, that's why high control groups do the tactics and the techniques that they do, because, you know, you can easily repress a lot of free thought. Are cults more common as standalone organizations or sects of larger religions? The answer, I think, is probably both. My guess would be that most of them are probably splinter groups from established religions, particularly since the rise of monotheism, which is a relatively new phenomenon as far as the world goes. But again, I mean, I guess not relatively new, because Judaism has been around for a very long time. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, the majority of the religions were monotheistic, right? Like, Judaism comes first, and then it's Catholicism, and then Islam, in that order. But again, I think that develops. Were there pagan holdouts after the conversion of Europe to Christianity? 100%. Many, in fact. One of the ones, and if I will remember, which I probably won't, but I will recommend the video from a guy called Horses, which is all about Icelandic witch cults that literally just exist long into the modern age, which is kind of crazy as well. Is a following around a spiritual person a cult? I would say yes, as long as you venerate them, worship them, and it is outside of the in-group. Where did the popular image of black-robe cultists standing around chanting and sacrificing things with an evil dagger originate? So I don't necessarily know where all of this originates, but I will go over at least a few of the different concepts and ideas. One of them is that the idea of the witch's sabbat, which was something that they cover in the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a Catholic witch hunter's manual, which is a kind of a raw read, if I'm being honest. They do mention that. But I think the idea of cultists, the black-robed, sacrificial dagger-wielding cultists in fantasy role-playing games, comes from our earliest influences. They come from Conan the Barbarian and from H.P. Lovecraft, respectively. Those, I think, played a very pivotal role, a very formative role in Gary Gygax and his team when they were creating Dungeons & Dragons for the first time, and as that was the big first role-playing game in general, that really went on to sort of create a lot of stuff, and I do think that matters. Which medieval people were actually likely to join a cult? All of, probably the peasantry, if we're being completely honest, those who had the least to lose and the most to gain by upending the social structure. I would argue that those are there, but I think anybody would. And apocalyptic cults usually imagine the apocalypse would leave them in a better place. Sometimes, but I'll be honest, a lot of apocalyptic cults were just like, can't get any worse, let's just do whatever. It's essentially the screw it, we ball mentality. Ignacio, thanks, man. Wish me well. Thanks, brother. I appreciate it. How much of, that's a cult derives from proselytization. That's a really interesting thing. Maybe before organized religion, a certain group wouldn't be a cult, and after it would be. Yes, that I think is exactly true. Right, when we are referring to what is and what isn't a cult, what we are talking about are things that break away from the established cultural and political norms of a society, of a given society. It's why I think Romans, quote-unquote, cults, or Greek quote-unquote cults are so far less known, because it's not that they were more secretive or less secretive. I just think that the Greeks and the Romans didn't particularly care quite as much, because they were like, whatever, we're already worshiping a bunch of gods anyway. And in many cases, those gods represent different aspects of them. I don't want to speak too much about it because I'm not very familiar with Hinduism or with Hindu scripture, certainly not as much so as I am with the Torah and with the Old and New Testament, and a little bit with the Quran. But one of the things I do think is really interesting in Hinduism is that certain deities have different aspects, and that it is possible for you to worship a given aspect of that deity, and that aspect of that deity might cover or be or pertain to different things, which I think is particularly cool and particularly interesting. This comes up in my favorite book of all time, which is a book of poems called Jeopardy, because the guy is going to a religious festival dedicated to Khandoba, which is an aspect of the god Vishnu. So again, I think it just depends on what a cult, a place values. In a place of total 100% religious tolerance, I could see it happening. But again, a place like that, a cult might use their ability to sort of work their way in and maybe become an enemy of the people, at which point they would become a cult. They'd be, try to be forced out. Twin Steel, thanks Twin Steel. Wish me well as well. Thank you, man. Favorite home remedy? I don't know if it's a home remedy or not, but one of the things that I do, we used to do in college when we thought we were going to get sick, was we would take the big, like 25 ounce dining hall cup, and you'd fill it with a lot of ice, so that as you drank the drink, the ice would melt, so you'd get the water, and then you would fill it half with cranberry juice and half with orange juice. And the idea is the antioxidants and the vitamin C would help you fight things off. And it would come out as this weird pink-looking liquid that we called dragon's blood. And I remember drinking that very heavily, like when I thought I was getting sick, with the rugby team and with some of my friends who played lacrosse, which was pretty funny. Ironically enough, didn't drink in college. I had my first beer at 21, which is kind of funny, but I would drink dragon's blood when I felt like I was getting sick. So I have vivid memories of sitting in the dining hall and a bunch of my friends are hungover and they're like, "Why are you doing this?" And I was like, "I have a test on Monday. I don't want to get sick." Oh man, it was a great time. Funny/scary medieval home remedies is an interesting one to consider here, which is unrelated to cults, but I'll talk about it right now. Obviously, leeches, lots of leeches. Trepanation is probably the scariest one, and that has, I don't know if it's quite medieval or not, but it's been around for a while. It's where you would drill a hole into someone's head to release pressure, which don't drill a hole into someone's skull. It generally speaking does not go well for that individual. And was being lefty in medieval times a problem? Yes, in many cases it was seen as a cultural stigma. In many cases now it was seen as a cultural stigma, and because everything is built with the exception of the idea that you're right-handed, like lefties I think live like on average like 5 to 7% less long than their right-handed counterparts. Again, not cult related, but they were fun. Jonathan asked one of the best questions, and I'm very excited to get to this one. In a world with active gods, do you think seemingly benevolent gods might allow their believers to be co-opted by a dangerous cult or figure? If so, why? And I think it depends entirely on how active a god is in their pantheon. If we're going based on the regular fantasy stuff, where we start thinking about gods only being strong in terms of how much belief they get, like this is the American Gods by Neil Gaiman school of thought, then I think it makes sense that if somebody is being, if your worshippers are being co-opted by a cult, you as a deity might not have the strength to do it. Or it's entirely possible that a cult isn't actually the outgroup that people think it is, but is an aspect of you, and you're okay with it because either way you're the one getting worship, right? I think a little bit about St. Cuthbert, who, despite being a good deity within the D&D pantheon, is a relatively violent one, which I think is interesting. And if so, why? If not, how might the gods prevent that? Again, it also depends, this question depends on how interested in free will the gods within your setting are. And the big question there, the big important question, at least to me and for me, is if a god is really interested in free will and they're really concerned oh no. Ooh, all right, soon we will be sleeping. If not, why? Again, if they're really interested in free will, it might prevent them from doing it. For less benevolent gods, how might they or their followers convince normal people to follow them? Well, not to get too political, but look at the political landscape right now. When people are not doing well, we tend to go with whatever is not in the current in-group and with whatever we think is actually going to help us. And I think that's a big problem, right? To the detriment of other things, right? It's like, why do people elect populist leaders in any way, shape, or form? It's because they think that those will help them, even though those will not help them, right? Like if you look right now at the cost of living crisis, the inflation, you look at people who are struggling to find jobs, the threat of AI, global conflict happening pretty much everywhere, a lack of media trust and media literacy in general. I think there's a lot of reasons and a lot of ways that you could convince somebody to do something that is not within the realm of their best interest, I think. If you're a god, particularly an evil god, a malignant or malevolent god, I would play on that. I think this is 100% what I would do. Because again, it's not that I want to say that people are mean or stupid, because I don't think that's true, but I do think that people are more willing to take drastic action if their basic needs are not being met. And so I think that might be a really big thing, in particular for somebody to do, or for someone to use. If they were going to do that, I think that's how you would do so. All right, and now we go to the Discord. If you would like to join these things, you can of course join over at the Discord. That's where you can do all kinds of cool stuff. All right, so we are going to talk about this. Twin Steel asked what my favorite cult is. If you have been paying attention in the video, I think my favorite cult is the Cult of Mithras. I really do love that cult. I think it's really particularly interesting. It's also really interesting that quite a few cults or religious movements that offer eternal life, either in the form of an afterlife that you get to live in eternal joy and bliss, or reincarnation, a chance to live this life again, generally tend to do much better than fatalistic cults that just say you don't get anything back. I think that's really interesting. And it makes sense, by the way, why the Christians would try to eliminate and exterminate the Cult of Mithras, because in many ways they offer their biggest competition, which I think is really interesting. Chris Bates asked, why do all cults end up being aspects of Nyarlathotep, which is H.P. Lovecraft deity? I would imagine if you were assuming the world has has some level of Cthulhu-esque influence, it's just because Nyarlathotep loves to play games. Iron Bones said cults are just indie artisanal religions, which is actually not entirely false. Twin Steel pointed out that religions are just mainstream sellouts, and that cults of cults, and they aren't very punk rock. They lose that at that point. We talked a little bit about maybe starting a cult to Prince, which I would probably do. Which cults, Salty Nick asks, which cult are you not allowed to name a cult or you'll get death threats? Probably Scientology, if we're being honest. That one is a particularly odious one. I know they've had a lot of stuff going on in terms of like lawsuits that have been there, and some really sketchy disappearances, and some sexual basalt cover-ups that have been sort of having that. Weirdly enough, I think a lot of the people who comment about the fact that we talk about safety tools are kind of like this too. I've gotten more death threats, I think, from those people. Actually, I've gotten more death threats, I think, in the last year than I've gotten in my entire life, which is kind of wild to think about. Like, it's like not flattering, but like it's a sign that I'm kind of making it on the internet a little bit. Yeah, it's very weird because it's not the first time it's happened. I played Call of Duty on like original Xbox lobbies in like 2000. So there's a lot that has been said to me by like 45-year-old men with like really bad headset mics. Oh man, I kind of miss those days actually. Doc Bones asked, how do I start one? I don't think I can answer that question, buddy. And will I end up financially growing from investment? Yes. Yes, I think in many ways. Cults, Ponzi schemes gone right. In a lot of cases, yeah, actually, that's pretty true. All right, gonna scroll through a couple more questions. Salty Nick asked, why do cultists always wear robes? Give us 5 suggestions for how to dress our cultists less cliche. This is a great question. We talked about it a little bit earlier in the Q&A section, but I think a lot of this has to do with Lovecraft and with Howard, who wrote Conan. I think that's just a lot. Also, too, I think there's an association with cults and magic and with wizards and robes, so I think there's probably a one-to-one correlation there. If you're going to have them dress in more unique ways, you could tie them to some of the stuff that I think a lot of folks did. Iron Bones actually pointed out pretty nicely that Midsommar does a really great job with the flower costumes that they have. I think that is a really cool way to do it. If it's a militaristic cult, you can always sort of adapt those robes into armor of some kind. I think Arthas's uniform when he was the Lich King in Warcraft 3 does a really, really good job of illustrating what that might look like. Again, basic military structure too. I think this is something that happens quite a lot when your military leader becomes a religious leader, becomes a political leader, and all that gets sort of roped all into one. Or if you're doing barbarian cults, some of the things, like if they're just coming at you roaring naked and just covered in war paint, that's pretty terrifying too. I think that's 5. If it's not 5, then one of the things you could do is have the cultists skin enemy religious members and wear the skin. like robes, which I think is also kind of terrifying. It's like what Fabius Bile does in Warhammer. So, foolish samurai warrior. That's a pretty good Aku impression. I don't actually know if I could do that when I'm not sick. Might be a dumb question, but did cults hypothetically have different religious chants or music from more mainstream religions? This actually is going to be one of the things that I think is super, super important. So in some cases, yes, they would have similar chants because some cults, some off-sect religious groups would in fact use the existing chants or existing religious structure and ceremony and co-opt it for their own benefit in their own ways. I think that's pretty exciting and interesting, but some would change. One of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was researching for this video, because I knew a lot about the events leading up to and the military movements and political machinations behind the Albigensian Crusade, right? It was one of the reasons that I studied it. We talk a lot about their motivations, why I think the Crusades were more politically and monetarily or economically motivated than they were religiously motivated. But I got a chance to, really delve into the Cathars and what they believed, and it's interesting that, like, the Cathars believed that everything on Earth was so corrupt that they were like, cool, we're going to reject the use of water in our religious rites, and so, which is crazy because, like, obviously they're a Catholic offshoot, and if you have spent any time in a Catholic church, you know how important water is to the religious rites of Catholics, particularly like baptism, but also, holy ordination, all kinds of stuff. And so for them to, like, wholesale reject water, and then there's a focus on the community in the Cathars, and so in order to be baptized, you'd be laid on in hands. So I think it just depends on the backstory that you give your cultists, but I think, it's entirely possible or plausible that they would take and co-opt or reinterpret religious rites as needed, or reject certain aspects of it too. Kavadi asked, how do you communicate to your players that the cult you're referring to is just a group with a localized religious belief about an aspect of a particular deity and not Heaven's Gate? This is really interesting, actually, because I think in the modern cultural parlance, people know more about cults and as such are willing to do it and willing to, like, look at it. I honestly wouldn't even necessarily, there's a couple ways you could go about it. You could start by calling them a cult, but if you're noticing that your players are having trouble accepting them as anything other than, like, a Heaven's Gate, what you could do is you could introduce them as just another group, and let the players come to the conclusion that they're dealing with a cult in general. You could also allow them to be a good cult. And this does happen all the time. It really is, like, a huge deal, but, like, this happens all the time where not every cult was necessarily bad or necessarily evil. They're not all robe chanting and stabby. Some of them are actually pretty good. And so it's interesting if, like, the players have to deal with, oh my gosh, I'm going to keep coughing. It's like 90% of the cuts from this video were, like, me doing, like, cutting right when I was about to start coughing. But I think what you could do is introduce the cults as, like, a good organization. That might be interesting too. But I think that's pretty interesting. All right, witch cults. We talked a lot about witch cults. Yes, witch cults happen. All right, moving on. Sorry, everybody. I'm gonna continue to scroll down because now we're talking about how the HOA is basically a cult. There's, like, one more question that I wanted to get to. Okay, all right, and okay, there it is. Last question. This is from Luke Birchtree. Serious question. When does a cult start transforming into a sect or a full-blown religion? This is something I covered, I think, at the beginning of the Q&A, but again, I think it's when it gains political and cultural acceptance and relevance, and I think at that point it becomes its own thing, which is exactly what happened with Christianity and with Judaism and with Islam and Buddhism and pretty much, like, every major established religion at some point. I think went from being, like, an outgroup. I think maybe not Judaism, because Judaism's been around for a while. Although, historically, the Jews have been treated pretty much like cults, like, everywhere, which is not a good thing. Like, like, oh, good Lord. Like, one of the things that we did, or that I did when I was discerning the priesthood, was, like, learning a lot about Jewish history. I was very fortunate in that one of my teachers was not nationally, but was a scholar of the Holocaust and on Jewish history in general. And so learning about the historical treatment of the Jews, that's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot to consider. So yeah, but I think that, I'm going on a tangent, but yeah, I think just gaining cultural, political acceptance and relevance. How do cults target and facilitate recruitment? That is really interesting. I actually think Scientology offers a pretty good example of this right now, because one of the things that they do is they like to tie into pop culture. You'll notice that Scientology likes to recruit actors and actresses, not necessarily just because they're rich and are thus able to be fleeced for their money, but also because they give them a sort of cultural cachet that allows the Scientologists to gain access to more recruits, which I think is a thing. I think it's important. But yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think, too, you can prey on the desperate. It's, I think, one of the reasons evil cults tend to do well, because you prey on people when they're at their most vulnerable, at their lowest point, and that lets you do a little bit more with them. And then a non-serious question. Luke asked, how close does the average play session of Becoming Banana Bread line up with an actual cult? So we talked about this a little bit in one of the other videos, but oh my gosh. Oh, I cannot wait for this to be done. Not the Q&A. I cannot wait to be not whatever is going on. I would say probably not, because it's all in good fun for the most part. But it is funny to watch people bring in their own sensibilities, their own religious and cultural sensibilities to that game, and how they react and interact with others in it, I think is really neat and really interesting. And I think that brings us to the end of the Q&A. Oh, we did it. Thank you all again so much for watching. Like I said, I know this was a very long Q&A. You all had a lot of great questions about cults, just in general, and I really love and appreciate it. So thank you again so much. We are almost at 10K subscribers. We are like 1,800 and some away, which is just like wild at this point. Just like, well, we're not 1,800. We're like 1,900 away at this point. No, we are 1,800 away at some, or 1,800-ish away at some point. So yeah. In any case, y'all are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.